The brittle vines felt like paper under the Empress's fingers. 7 years without tending had turned the royal greenhouse from a sanctuary into a graveyard of dried stems and suffocating dust. I watched her from the atmospheric control booth. As the station's chief botanist, my job was to monitor the soil pH and the ambient humidity. Officially. Unofficially, my job for the last 7 years had been watching Elvani Empress Valia slowly die of exhaustion. When the Alvani fleet retreated from the sector, they left her behind as a political anchor. A temporary measure, they called it. The fleet had promised to return within the solar cycle. They did not. I need to strike that from the official botanical log, but the truth remains. Valia had not rested since the day the armadas vanished into slip space. Her biology would not allow it. On Elvani's skin emits a bioluminescence that directly correlates to their neurological state. Under extreme prolonged stress, the glow turns into a harsh, blinding gold. For 7 years, the Empress had been a walking star. The light radiating from her collarbones and wrists was so intense, it cast sharp, unnatural shadows against the dead foliage. It was the light of a sovereign cornered, entirely alone, holding an invisible front line by sheer force of will. Her ceremonial braid hung limp over her left shoulder. It was supposed to be woven with heavy silver victory rings. The rings had been pawned to buy rations for her remaining guards years ago. Now the frayed ends of her silver hair just rested against the rusted iron of the greenhouse bench, catching the violent gold light of her own skin. She sat perfectly rigid. She always did. Why does an empire's collapse always sound like silence? And why does it take an entirely unqualified human to finally break it? The greenhouse doors hissed open. The Elvani royal guards, two towering figures clad in ceremonial armor, instantly leveled their plasma pikes. The air crackled with the sharp scent of ionized ozone. The intruder sneezed. It was the human librarian. I checked my manifest to be sure, but there was no mistaking the faded gray sweater and the stack of crumbling archival data pads clutched against his chest. His name was Elias, and he had been assigned to digitize the station's pre-digital flora records. He had absolutely no security clearance to be in Sector 4, let alone in the presence of an abandoned monarch. Nobody noticed him on a good day. Humans were a new addition to the station, generally ignored by the older, more established species. They were assigned the low-status jobs: maintenance, waste reclamation, archiving. They kept their heads down. Elias wiped his nose with the back of his sleeve, entirely oblivious to the two weapons aimed at his thorax. He peered at a physical map drawn on a piece of ancient paper. He looked left. He looked right. He shuffled past the heavily armed guards, who were so paralyzed by his complete lack of threat display that they simply forgot to fire. He walked down the central aisle of the greenhouse, setting his data pads down on a nearby potting table. He didn't bow. He didn't announce his presence with a formal recitation of lineage. He just pulled a microfiber cloth from his pocket and began wiping dust off a shattered hydroponic tube. There were 5 people on this station qualified to pour water near the Empress. A librarian was not one of them, but the others weren't here at midnight. I was logging a 0.2% variance in the western quadrant's soil moisture. I remember that clearly. The irrigation valve above bed 4 was dripping, a steady, hollow sound against the metal grating. I focused on that drip for entirely too long. It was easier than looking at the blinding gold exhaustion radiating from the bench. The librarian finished wiping the tube. He picked up his data pads. He walked over to the rusted iron bench. Valia did not turn her head. Her posture remained absolute. The gold light flaring off her cheekbones was sharp enough to cut glass. Elias looked at the empty space on the bench next to her. "This seat taken?" He didn't wait for a royal decree. He just sat down. The guards at the door twitched, their armor locking with a sharp, synchronized click. Elvani protocol dictated immediate execution for breathing the same unfiltered air as the sovereign without an invitation. Elias crossed his legs. He placed his data pads on his lap. He exhaled a long, tired sigh that sounded universally heavy, the sound of a worker at the end of a 14-hour shift. On the small table, bolted to the bench, an old condensation pitcher sat full of purified water. Next to it rested a single glass. Elias reached over. He picked up the heavy pitcher. He poured her water. That was it. 2 seconds of motion. He didn't offer a toast. He didn't grovel. He simply filled the glass to the brim, slid it 2 inches across the iron table until it rested near her hand, and set the pitcher back down. Masa, as he pulled his arm back, the rough wool of his sleeve accidentally grazed the frayed, unadorned end of her braid resting on the table. The braid was warm where he'd touched it. She pressed her fingers against the same spot. The heat was already fading. She held on anyway. The gold light inside the greenhouse stuttered. I dropped my diagnostic tablet. It hit the floor grates. I didn't pick it up. Elvani's skin glow dims to soft silver near someone's safe. It is a biological absolute. It cannot be faked, manufactured, or forced. It requires the nervous system to completely and totally power down its threat assessment centers. Valia's collarbones flickered. For 7 years, she had been a burning sun of unending stress. The sheer, one crushing weight of holding an abandoned throne together had kept her veins flooded with adrenaline and gold light. No one had offered her a drink without requiring a treaty in return. No one had sat beside her without an agenda. No one had treated her like a person who might just be thirsty. The blinding gold light flared one last time, a dying star fighting its own collapse. Then it cracked. The harsh yellow shifted. The edges of her glowing veins softened. The light bleeding through her translucent skin began to cool, dropping from a violent gold into a quiet, muted silver. She stopped breathing. Her shoulders, locked into a military brace for nearly a decade, dropped a fraction of a millimeter. It was the physical equivalent of a structural support beam giving way. The exhaustion of 7 years hit her all at once, a rushing into the space that the adrenaline had just vacated. She didn't speak. She couldn't. Her fingers remained clamped around the end of her braid. The silence in the greenhouse fractured. The guards at the entrance lowered their weapons. It wasn't a conscious decision. They saw the silver light. Their own biological imperatives recognized the visual cue for absolute safety, and their rigid muscles involuntarily relaxed. The sharp smell of ozone faded into the damp, heavy scent of soil and resting flora. The air itself felt different. The tension that had held the dead leaves in a state of static electricity finally grounded itself. On the table, the surface of the water in the glass rippled slightly from the vibration of the station's distant engines. The human librarian didn't notice any of this, for he had already picked up his top data pad and was squinting at a blurry schematic of a moss spore. The silver light reflecting off his screen didn't seem to register as a planetary-level biological event to him. It was just better lighting to read by. Valia stared at the glass of water. The condensation was beginning to beat on the outside of the crystal, slowly rolling down to pool on the rusted iron. Her silver glow washed over the water, turning it into a pool of liquid moonlight. She hadn't taken a drink yet. She just watched the water settle, and the librarian turned the page. He poured a glass of water. He didn't know he had just altered the political gravity of the sector. The silence is settling. Part 2 is coming. The silence in the greenhouse ceased to be an absence of noise and became a physical weight. No one spoke. No one moved. The microscopic hum of the station's ventilation system sounded like a roaring engine in the void left by the fading gold light. Valia's bioluminescence had completely cooled. The harsh, blinding armor of her stress was gone. In its place, a soft, pearlescent silver pooled across her collarbones and cascaded down her arms. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. I reached for the emergency comm link to alert the medical wing that the Sovereign was experiencing a complete physiological collapse. But Elias turned another page. The dry rustle of ancient paper echoed against the glass walls. My hand froze over the console. I did not press the button. The atmospheric sensors, which I am required by standard employment protocol to calibrate every single solar cycle without fail, were suddenly returning ambient temperature readings that suggested the entire western quadrant of the greenhouse was rapidly cooling down to a baseline habitable norm. The heat of her panic was dissipating. Her lungs expanded. The motion was so deep and so sudden that it caused her entire torso to shudder. For the first time in 14 years, she was taking a breath that did not hurt. Her eyelids fluttered shut. The rigid military lock of her spine finally gave way. She slumped infinitesimally against the back of the rusted iron bench. She was completely unguarded. An assassin could have walked through the door, and she would not have noticed, because her nervous system had simply shut down its perimeter defenses. Even the silence knew. Elias kept reading. He shifted his weight, crossing his left ankle over his right knee. The movement caused his worn canvas shoe to brush against the hem of her ceremonial robes. She did not flinch. Her body leaned closer to the point of contact. It was an involuntary biological gravitation toward a localized gravity well of absolute safety. The guards at the door were staring straight ahead, their eyes wide and unblinking. They were witnessing the undoing of a monarch by a man in a frayed sweater. The hinge on Elias's datapad squeaked. It needed a drop of synthetic oil. Maintenance was always behind on their requisition forms. 20 minutes passed in the quiet dark. Elias eventually closed his book. He gathered his stack of datapads and tapped them against his knee to align the edges. The dull thud of plastic against bone signaled the end of the shift. He stood up. The silver light mapping Valia's veins instantly stuttered. A microscopic flicker of gold spiked at her wrists. Her eyes snapped open. The source of her rest was moving away. The anchor was lifting. Her jaw tightened as she prepared to brace herself against the crushing weight of the universe returning to her shoulders. She stopped correcting herself. Elias did not walk away immediately. He looked down at the bench. He looked at the heavy gray sweater he had draped over the iron armrest to cushion his elbow. He looked at the Empress, who was staring at the glass of water he had poured, her hands resting flat on the table. He didn't bow. "I'll be here." But she didn't know that yet. None of them did. The gold spark at her wrist died instantly. Elvani tear ducts do not produce saline. They vent excess thermal energy. A wisp of soft, silver vapor plumed from the corner of her left eye, vanishing into the cool greenhouse air. Elias turned and walked down the aisle. He walked past the guards, who parted for him as if he were carrying the weight of the Admiralty on his slumping shoulders. The doors hissed open and swallowed him into the corridor. Valia was alone again, but the room was not empty. Her metacarpal ridges locked, fighting the instinct to summon a plasma shield, and instead wrapped around the condensation-slicked crystal glass. She brought the rim to her lips. She drank. The water was room temperature. It was entirely ordinary. I was clinically fascinated and simultaneously drafting my resignation letter. I had a dinner rotation scheduled with my mate in 10 minutes. The synthetic protein was probably burning in the thermal unit. I didn't care. She drained the glass. She set it down with a soft, decisive click against the iron table. She looked at the empty space beside her. The faded gray sweater remained on the armrest. It smelled faintly of old paper and ozone. The historical precedent for this level of bioluminescent dampening was, I don't know the precedent. I am a botanist. My job is to watch the plants grow. But over the next solar cycle, the bureaucratic fallout was spectacular. 7 ambassadors requested clarification on whether a blanket left on a chair constituted a territorial claim. The Security Council held 3 emergency sessions regarding the structural integrity of Sector 4. They analyzed threat vectors. They reviewed security footage. They entirely missed the point. It was already done. Just a man in a quiet room and the end of an era. 3 weeks later, the dead vines behind the rusted iron bench began to show microscopic buds of green. The midnight routine was identical every single night. The doors would hiss open. The guards would lower their pikes. The human would shuffle in, entirely blind to the sheer political impossibility of his presence. He would sit down. He would pour the water. Valia would wait. She no longer sat with rigid military perfection. The heavy silver victory rings had not been pawned. They had simply been left in her quarters. Her long frayed braid no longer hung limp and forgotten. She had retied it deliberately. She used a simple, coarse piece of botanical twine left behind on the potting table. It wasn't a choice anymore. The silver light in the greenhouse was a constant, soft hum. The glass of water sat on the table. The sweater remained on the armrest. Rest came quietly, like water poured.